Hello, it's Monday, May 18th, and welcome to Minutes That Matter. Well, turn in your Bible with me to Matthew chapter 5, and as you're turning there, allow me to ask, have you ever been in a conversation with someone and either they or you just weren't getting it? Now, mind you, it wasn't a matter of intellect. Rather, you possibly had started off the conversation at two entirely different beginning points, which then brought you to two different destinations. Now, here's why we're talking about that. Christ knew that this same dynamic was happening with many of those listening to his sermon. So, he takes a moment to make some clarifying statements. They are statements that get to the heart of what he's talking about. And so follow along as I quote verses 17 through 20 of Matthew chapter 5. Well, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, what Jesus was saying and what he was yet to say was incredibly different than what the people were used to listening to and had been told by the religious leaders of the day. They would be so astounded and so moved by what Christ would say that at the end of his sermon, Matthew would record at the end of chapter 7, and when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. You see, the Jew that was listening to Jesus would have understood that their way to a relationship with God and the intimacy and security of that relationship was based on acts of self-righteousness, by keeping a list of do's and don'ts that included not just the moral law, but judicial and ceremonial law that Moses had given. But then much of this law that had been given by Moses had been substituted with traditions and teachings of religious leaders, which made things even more confusing, more frustrating, and impossible to keep. But now, to some, Christ seemed to be annulling everything and substituting it with a whole new list of do's and don'ts that people had to keep to earn their righteousness before God. And so in these 4 verses that we're going to be looking at this week, Christ wants to set the record straight, and he wants to set their thinking straight. And one of the key verses in the passage, and indeed in the entire sermon, is found in verse 20. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The main theme of this sermon is about true righteousness and who is the source of that righteousness. Friends, it's not about keeping the law to get to heaven. That's not good enough. It's not about advice for nations or individuals, about world peace. It's an issue of the heart for individuals. It's not just about the future, even though he speaks of that. He expected obedience and change out of his disciples right then. And so, as we prepare to look at these 4 verses in the week ahead, allow me to ask, what makes up the substance of your relationship with God? Is it a set of man-made rules? And mind you, I don't necessarily mean the list of self-righteous do's and don'ts that we often think of when we're asked such a question. What about the structures, habits, human authors that we follow, and even systems of spiritual growth that we cling to, but we've allowed to become a substitute for our relationship with God? As we face the week ahead, allow me to encourage all of us to keep a tender heart for what we might have substituted for Christ's righteousness in our life. Because remember, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, again, if this was an encouragement to you, hit the thumbs up button. If you're not yet a subscriber, hit the subscribe button. Hit the little bell button if you want to know when a new video comes out, and please leave a comment or question below. We would love to talk with you. And from all of us at Minutes That Matter, Have a blessed day.